I interviewed my grandfather, who was born on March 11th, 1945. I chose to interview him because he experienced the world changing from the 1950s to the 1970s.
Turned 15 years old in 1960 and 24 years old in 1969.
He grew up in a rental apartment in downtown Chicago with his six siblings and his parents. His father believed in four very important things.
Believed in family and,
Hmm.
hard work.
Yeah. All through high school, he went to an all white school. This law did not change until 1954. My grandfather goes on to explain that the 1950s were a time where Eisenhower was president and everything was
Our times were good.
great. Hmm.
Um, People were working. They were making a very good living. Um, you know, the country was, believed in, religion.
The 1950s started to come to a close and the 1960s started. My grandfather goes on to explain the three biggest changes were the Vietnam War, the civil rights movements, and the counterculture change.
What their parents believed in the 1950s was not really going to get them through the 1960s because there was so much going on. The Vietnam War and, civil rights and
Yeah.
counterculture. Um,
I asked my grandfather if he remembers President Kennedy's assassination on November 22nd of 1963 by Lee Oswald in Dallas, Texas. Everyone was very upset after his death.
During that time when he was assassinated, they would tell you exactly where they were. Nobody forgot. I mean, it was so traumatic.
Yes.
Unfortunately, in 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated. Stopped believing, because they really believed in President Kennedy.
The Vietnam War was underway and people did not know what to do after his death. The Vietnam War lasted from November 1st, 1955 to April 30th, 1975. It was in South Vietnam, North Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The result was the North Vietnamese won, and the United States withdrew from the war. Two-thirds of the American troops volunteered to go to Vietnam, and the other one-third of the troops were from the draft lottery. It was common for young men to be deferred if they had a physical or mental problem, were married, attended college, or needed to be home to support their family. Most of these men were upper-class men, who were very wealthy and had a good education, which made most of the troops low-class or middle-class men.
The Vietnam War probably for me was had the most impact on my
Okay.
life during that time because of the uncertainty of what was going on over there.
Yeah.
It was not very. Um, uh, it was not looked upon very favorable here in the U.S. There was a lot of people who didn't want nor understand what was going on. Fortunately, I was in college, and so when your education was finished, then you would be drafted.
Before the interview, I never understood who was a candidate to get drafted and who was exempt. After my research and my grandfather's explanation, I learned that if you were enrolled in college or were a teacher, you were exempt from getting drafted. My grandfather shared a very important story that made me really think about how traumatizing it was to get drafted.
One good friend who lived in my neighborhood who went to Vietnam and was killed. Um, and for me, that was a very trying time. Not only was I here, not exempt from being drafted, he wasn't. He was drafted and was sent to Vietnam and then was killed.
Yeah. I asked my grandfather his thoughts on the war after his friend was killed, and he explained that from that point on, he was against the war but did not join in on any protests. The biggest protest in Chicago was the Democratic National Convention protest in 1968 that lasted from August 23rd to August 28th. I asked my grandfather if he remembered any of this.
There was a number of people who protested in the civil rights and the Vietnam War, and it turned very ugly. People who were injured both on both sides.
Even though my grandfather was 30 minutes away from the convention center in Chicago, he still saw the pain and brutality this protest caused. My grandfather goes on to explain how music helped people cope with Kennedy's assassination and the cultural change that was occurring.
Music was a big part of the 60s, and that's
Yeah.
how they expressed themselves. That's how they got their message across. As you know, all of a sudden there were these riots and protesters, and because they wanted now change. They didn't
Yeah.
believe on they didn't believe in the country was going in the direction that they wanted it to.
The Beatles, a rock band from the 1960s to the 1970s, originated in Liverpool, England. They had four members, and people loved how they acted and sounded, completely different from anything anyone had ever seen before. They turned music into an art with a new musical empire that took people's minds off the 1960s and expressed freedom with rock music.
Make love, not war,
Mm-hmm.
and that's so they change their clothes. The men let their hairs.
Overall, I think it is important to realize how aware everyone was about the Vietnam War, cultural change, and civil rights movement, even if they weren't participating in the war. The most important thing I learned is when I asked my grandfather, looking back on his experience in the 1960s, if he would have gone to war, and he says he would have. I think this shows how much hope everyone had for America, even during these rough times.
If I had to, I would.